Hello, everyone, and thanks for joining us for our webinar today on protecting intellectual property and trade secrets with a data-centric security model. First, just to go over some logistics. We'll be handling any questions today through the Zoom webinar Q&A interface. So you should be able to type out any questions that you have, and we will either try to answer them during the course of the webinar, or we'll answer them at the end when we'll have an open Q&A session. You should be able to see the button for asking any questions at the bottom of the Zoom webinar interface. Also, this webinar will be recorded and will be available online after it has been completed and we've done the post-processing on the video. Everyone who has registered and or attended will receive a link to that recording, and you can share that with anyone that you would like. So with that, let's get started. First, just to introduce those of us who will be presenting on this webinar. My name is Tony Burning. I'm a senior product manager here at NextLabs. And today I'm joined by Victor Garcia Rodriguez, who is an associate partner with IBM Security and is the global lead for the SAP security practice. The format of the webinar today. First, Victor will go over things from IBM's point of view, specifically going over some of the challenges in protecting the trade secrets in the digital economy and what IBM sees as the drivers for move to data-centric security, and also how the NextLabs portfolio of products and solutions fits into that approach. Then I will be going over some of the common practices and approach that we see, go over our data-centric security solution, and then we'll have some time to go into some use cases and some demos. Then at the end, there will be some time for some Q&A, where both Victor and I will be available to answer any questions. So with that, I will turn it over to Victor.
Okay, well, in this slide, we are going to discuss some of the challenges in protecting trade secrets in the digital economy. And we are going to do that in the context of two different dimensions. The first one is related to the control and secure the access to the critical enterprise data, something that all of us know as the crown jewels. This is very important, and especially something that we see in our clients is the identification of those crown jewels, because the most of them don't have a clear view on this, and particularly in the context of SAP. The most of them are considering all the SAP system crown jewels, and most probably that is not the best approach. But the second point is about the perimeter-based and network-centric security approaches are not longer sufficient. We clearly see this in the market. So the former idea that, or the old idea that this is sufficient with the combination of roles and authorizations is an approach that is not working anymore. And the third reflection in terms of access management is allow employees to access data safely. This is from three different perspectives: anytime, anywhere, on any device. We will reflect later, particularly on the third topic, and how important is becoming an approach like bring your own device. This is from an access management perspective, but the industry is imposing challenges as well. First one is the ability to enable the global sharing of information necessary for the designing the best-in-class products for your company. And as well, being able to safeguard the vital corporate intellectual property, especially in certain industries. So we can think in industries like technology, industries like defense, pharma, and as well, the regulatory requirements. For those industries that I have just mentioned, those are highly impacted from a regulatory management perspective. And this requires technical measures to protect this data. Well, we have set the scene with this initial slide. And now we move to the next one, where we are going to discuss on how the security requirements are changing in this digital environment. Well, in this slide, we can see here 4 different layers that are the most relevant: identity and access management, application security, data security, and networks and communications. And we can analyze this from the two different perspectives, the perspective of the old requirements and the new requirements. From an old requirements perspective, we see that in terms of IAM, we are basically focused on protection of the employees, in application security, on-premise applications, and quite focused on email as the main way to exchange information. Data security, the approach is, basically discretionary. We are doing it very few times and for very specific components. And the way to get access to the network is basically using company managed PCs. Well, the environment has changed a lot because we are adding, in the context of IAM, the employees, we are adding partners, customers, or even strangers that are accessing to our network to get access to our systems. From an application security perspective, the importance of the cloud, the hyperscalers, and the public SaaS solutions that are interacting with our on-prem applications. And of course, we are exchanging information from many different medias, social, and well, we are using tools as, for instance, could be a Slack, Box, so exchanging information with our clients. And in terms of data security, it's imposed, share this information, this data in a secure manner. And from a network and communication perspective, as we have mentioned, we have the bring your own devices approach. We are bringing tablets, a smartphone, many new devices that are getting access to the network, to our systems, to our applications, and to our data. Well, this next slide, we are going to reflect on the two different approaches, network-centric security versus data-centric security. From a network-centric security, there is no question about your access to the network. Once that you have access to the network, it's assumed that you have been trusted. That is an old-fashioned approach, of course, that is putting the only mechanism to protect the systems in the network. The second reflection here is that we have specific security systems to manage the identity and to get access into the network. We are reflecting here our system as, for instance, could be LDAP or the Active Directory as the main system in order to grant you access to the system. And finally, a reflection is that this model provides users and data protection, but is based on the following principles. First of all, based on an isolated physical location. Typically, we are getting access always through the same server, and exists a very discrete segregated network approach. Well, from a data-centric perspective, I think it's the opposite or almost the opposite. Nothing is assumed. The network cannot be trusted, and it's presumed to be compromised. This is the main principle of the zero trust approach that we will reflect later on this. And the network is important, of course, but it's only the first line of defense. All these security mechanisms, network separation, perimeter security, roles and authorizations, is not enough. It's not enough anymore. Well, data is now the key asset to secure. And as you can imagine, every day we are managing more and more data. So a traditional approach is not manageable. We are not able to protect data with a top-down approach as we were doing in the past. So, well, now we are focused on data centricity, and we need to protect our resources from the inside out instead of the outside in. We will reflect in the upcoming slides a little bit more on this principle. And very important as well that data centricity separates the data at the object level. So, well, this brings a different approach when we are able to connect directly the security to the data. And well, the final reflection on this slide is the importance of data-centric security as one of the main pillars of the zero trust approach. Well, what are the drivers for this data-centric security? As we have been reflecting during the previous slide, this kind of network-centric security approach has not been able to stop the increasing security problems that we have faced during the last years in terms of organizational and state-sponsored cyber attacks, malicious actors taking advantage of inadequate cybersecurity controls, and finally, data breaches by partners with trusted access to our system or to our network. And well, these kind of network walls have demonstrated that can work, but are too inflexible for today. They are too rigid. And we need to be much more flexible in an environment that is constantly being modified. And we are including cloud services, mobile, and methodologies and access mechanisms that are not easy to to control from a traditional point of view. So, well, as we have just mentioned, we are companies are investing a lot in the zero trust approach. And well, this makes sense in the context of data-centric security. I think that the most important aspects of this data-centric security approach, and particularly something that we can leverage with NextLabs software, is, first of all, the importance of the policies. Policies are very strong in terms of defining and delimit the access to departments, business unit, geographic locations, data classification. We can do that and apply different security mechanisms to different assets quite fast. And the second reflection on this is that it's not needed do this with code. So the approach is no code. We are creating and implementing these policies in a very easy manner and very rapidly. Well, how can we do this from an IBM perspective? I'm leading the practice at global level, and I think that one of the main reflections from an IBM perspective is that we are able to cover all the aspects related to security from both different dimensions. The compliance dimension, that is very important when we are trying to comply with all the audit requirements, all the regulatory requirements imposed by internal and external auditors and made by regulators as well. And the cybersecurity aspects, that are all the technical security that we need to implement to reply to the business needs. Well, this is our point of view, a high-level point of view, and we are implementing this kind of approach with something that we call the 13 layers of SAP security. That is a top-down approach that we can see in this slide. We are covering aspects as, for instance, governance and regulatory, access management, data privacy, continuous control monitoring from a compliance perspective, and most technical aspects from a cybersecurity. Topics as, for instance, authentication, application security, data encryption, infrastructure security. Well, in order to implement this, the best approach to implement this kind of security is following a top-down approach. This is the best approach for organization in order to implement a long-term journey. But typically, from a business perspective, we need to apply this in a most efficient manner when we are protecting the data. So this brings a bidimensional approach, and is the side-by-side approach that we are able to implement thanks to the usage of the NextLabs software. So you can see here that we are commenting on 3 different products in the NextLabs portfolio that are key for IBM in order to implement these initiatives. The first one is entitlement management, that extends the native SAP authorization model, allows us to use a fine-grained attribute-based controls based on policies. So we are able to modify the access of the users in a dynamic manner and based on the usage of policies. As I mentioned previously, avoiding the usage of code and implementing those policies quite fast. The second important aspect is digital rights management for SAP. Is a DLP solution that allows the implementation of those data protection rules that are needed to protect files and structured and unstructured information. And finally, data access enforcers that segregates the data dynamically and implements another way of authorization, especially putting a focus on the dynamic data masking. So, well, you can see that the NextLabs portfolio fits perfectly well with our 13 layers, providing a lot of protection and side-by-side protection in these 3 layers: access management, data privacy protection, and data encryption. And well, I think that this is all from my side. I hand over to Donny, that is going to explain the second half of this presentation. Thank you so much for your time today.
Thanks, Victor. So first, what I have here is a list of a number of different common practices that organizations employ to safeguard their information sharing. One of the things that I want to draw your attention to is the commonalities between a lot of these things. A lot of them deal with automating controls, automating processes, automating procedures, simplifying the process and eliminating any customization or ad hoc or one-off processes. We feel that this is true amongst a lot of these different common practices, just because that eliminates the possibility for error, eliminates the possibility of vulnerable points. When you have a simplified, automated, well-defined processes for safeguard your information sharing. And part of that is that it's part of what zero trust architecture, zero trust network architecture is all about, is that you have an automated process for verifying the user's authentication, verifying the user's access every time something is being accessed. So instead of relying on the network security, the network separation, keeping things secure, you assume that you protect things at the object level, at the data level. So so as Victor mentioned, the assumption is that the network has been compromised, that that you can't rely on that. And so instead you push the authentication and the validation downstream to do that validation at the data level, and you automate that as much as possible. Specifically in terms of how to apply data-centric security measures. So we don't necessarily see this as replacing role-based security or replacing network-based security. We see the data-centric security as augmenting that and providing another layer of security. So this is something that would supplement existing role-based measures that are already in place, but is an additional layer of security. And then we also feel like it is still important to have the network-based security, but then you have the data-centric security within the network, really implementing the principles of the zero trust architecture, zero trust network architecture, to make sure that things are kept secure, using the attributes of the data and attributes of the user to do that authentication and allow that access. The 5 elements, as we see it, to a data-centric security solution is, first of all, identifying what types of data you have and understanding where that data comes from, how it's used, where it needs to go, and who needs to use it. Then you need to define controls, you need to define policies, and also define the audits that are necessary to ensure that those policies are being correctly implemented and enforced. The next step is implementing that enforcement, that implementation of those policies, and making sure that you have the correct level of data protection. And finally, the last piece of this is having audit processes in place to make sure that you can check to see that the policies are being enforced correctly, being evaluated and enforced correctly, and that you have the record that you need for compliance purposes as well as for ensuring the security of your overall solution. So at NextLabs, we divide this into 4 different pillars or 4 different parts. First being classifying and labeling the data, again, knowing what data you have. Second is protecting the data at the source. This is where the data is originally created and used, protecting data on the move and when it's shared, and then finally having a robust monitoring, auditing, and reporting processes in place. So diving into that a little bit deeper, the first pillar of knowing your data. So you have to know what kind of data you have. It's the type of data, the restrictions around it, the regulations that apply to it, where it's being stored, how and who is allowed to access it. What are the restrictions allowed on who is allowed to access it? And then the second pillar, safeguarding data at the source. So about 90% of business critical data is created and managed within applications. So when that data is in those applications or it's being stored and it's at its source, then that's where you should be using attribute-based security to safeguard that data. So you can use attribute-based access control to augment the role-based access control that you may already have in place. And then you use the attributes of the data as well as the users and the environment all together to make sure that you've defined the policies to protect the data where it is being created and where it is being used. The next pillar is protecting the data on the move. And so especially in our more interconnected world, data often has to be extracted from the place where it is created and used, or the source, and then shared via either raw data or files or documents or unstructured data. And that's when that data is being shared or moved, that it also needs to be protected as well. So we approach this by providing a solution that provides a persistent digital rights management. So automating the tagging and applying the digital rights management protection to files that are exported and then saved outside of their original system, and then allowing that digital rights management to be persistent and apply even when the file has moved or the data has moved on to another network, or to another individual, or is used in different location. But having that persistent DRM is important to protecting the data while it's on the move. And then the final pillar is having the automatic monitoring, auditing, and reporting. So this really closes the loop on compliance requirements as well as good governance. So you can have the records, have the logs to show that the policies have been enforced at the appropriate points, both to prove compliance as well as to ensure the security of your system. So this monitoring, this auditing is also data-centric. So it's really focusing on the data that's being accessed, setting up monitors to look at it at the data level instead of at the network level or at the user level. So an example of how this might look is here's an example of an attribute-based policy. So what this is showing is combining user attributes such as the title of the user, what group they're in, where the country they're located in, combining that with environmental attributes, so the time of day or which network the user is connected to and accessing the data from, the resource attributes, so what type of data it is, in this case, an enterprise sales forecast in SAP, and then defining what actions can be performed on this data. So this particular combination may be limited to viewing, but not allow changing or adding or deleting, or it could allow changing, adding, or deleting. But it may depend on the user and also the combination of the attributes from the user, the environment, and the resource. So now I'll move into demos of how this looks in practice. The demos that I'm going to be showing you today are first how within SAP you can filter material master records. So this is utilizing DAE's record level filtering to limit access to the master records based on the product group of the user and the product group assigned to the material records. And then at the same time, also masking descriptions for users who are not in a production role, since those users should not have access to that information. The second example that I'll show you is filtering and masking business partner data. So again, using record level filtering to limit access to particular records. In this case, it will be to business partners who the user is specifically authorized to view. So these may be the business partners they're working with, but not allowing them access to the business partner information for business partners they aren't working with directly. And then combining that with the field level masking to mask the company name and identification information based on the user's role. So if the user does not have a role that would allow them to view all that information, then those values are masked for them. So now we'll dive into the demos themselves. For this demo, we will show how material master records can be protected by using both DAE's filtering and masking capabilities. Material master records will be filtered by the product group the user is a part of, so the users only see the materials related to their product group. The material descriptions will then also be masked for users that are not in a production role. We have 3 users in this demonstration. The first, user 01, is in a production role for the drivetrain group, so we'll be able to see unmasked records for materials related to that group. The second user, user 03, is in an accounting role for the finished bikes group, so we'll be able to see the material records for that group, but we'll have the descriptions masked. Finally, we have the end developer user, who is a power user, and as such has access to the records for all product groups. Since they are not in a production role, however, they will have the material descriptions masked, even though they are a power user. Let's take a look at how this is done with DAE. First, we'll look in the Control Center, where the policy is defined. Here we can see that we have defined a policy to filter the material master record, as well as mask the material descriptions. We have defined this policy to apply to all users and on the app server, as well as the tables that we want to filter and mask. Here in the predicate condition, we define that the material record should be filtered to match the user's product group. And here in the masking section, we specify the table and the field to mask, which is that for the product description. Here we can see that we are applying this mask if the user's role does not include production. Note that the user's roles, as well as the user's product group, are all being dynamically pulled from the SAP database to be used for the filtering and the masking. Now let's take a look at this in the SAP system. First, we'll look at the material list and material master view with the user 01 user. This user is part of the drivetrain product group, and so can see all materials associated with the drivetrain. Since they are in production, they can see the material descriptions as well. Now, if we view the same view with the user 03 user, this user is in the finished byte group, so only sees the material records for that product group. But since they are not in production, the description of each material is masked. Finally, we can view all of this with the end developer user, who is a super user. So if they go to the Mara table directly and try to view all records, they're able to see all materials for all the different product groups, but the descriptions are masked because they're not in production. This is true both for the Mara table as well as for the MAT table. Here you can see that descriptions are masked, even when viewing the table directly with the SE16 transaction. This concludes the demonstration of filtering and masking material master records with DAE. For this demo, we will show how business partner information can be protected by using both DAE's filtering and masking capabilities. An organization's business partners, whether they are vendors, suppliers, partners, or customers, is very valuable information and must be protected as a trade secret. Business partner records will be filtered by the business partner IDs the user is authorized to view, so that the users only see the records for the business partners they are authorized for. The business partner identification information will then also be masked for users that are not in a purchasing role. We have 3 users for this demonstration. The first, user 1, is in a sales role and is authorized to access the business partners in the range 1,000,000 to 1,000,009. So we'll be able to see those business partner records, but we'll have identifying information for those business partners masked. The second user, user 02, is in a purchasing role for the business partners in the range 1,000,010 to 1,000,050. So we'll be able to see those business partner records, and since they're in a purchasing role, the identification information will be unmasked. Finally, we have the end developer user, who is a power user, and as such has access to the records for all business partners. However, since they are not in a purchasing role, they will have all identification information masked, even though they are a power user. Let's take a look at this in the system. First, we will take a look at how the policy is defined in the NextLabs Control Center. Here we can see that we have defined a policy that applies to all users. And because the business partner identification information is spread out through multiple tables, we specify that this policy applies to all of those tables where that information is stored. Here in the predicate condition, this is where we define the filter that only will display business partner records to users that they are authorized to see. And then in the data masking section, here's where we specify which fields should be masked. Since the identification information is stored in multiple tables in SAP, we define this masking for all of the tables that are necessary. That's ADRC, BUT000, ADR2, ADR6. Note that the mask conditions, as well as the predicate conditions, are dynamically defined by values from the SAP database. Now we can take a look at this in the system. First, we will take a look at the business partner's information when logged in as user 01. Here we can see that for them, the information is masked. If we open up the information for the business partners, we can see that even within, the information is masked. If we then look at the information for user 02, who is in the purchasing department, we can see that for theirs, for them, the information for the business partners is unmasked. We can still see that the partner IDs for which they are authorized have been used as a filter. If we click into any of these, we can see that the information is also unmasked at the display organization level. Finally, if we try to view the information directly in the table using the SC16 transaction with the power user, in this case, the in-developer user, we will see that the identification information is still masked, even though they are a power user. This is because this user is not in a purchasing role. In this way, data is protected even when in developer, debugging, or power user mode. Okay, now we're going to open it up for any questions. As a reminder, you can type out any of your questions using the Zoom webinar Q&A interface, and then Victor and I will be able to answer those questions as they come in. I think that for the first question, are there any situations where it doesn't make sense to use a data-centric security approach? Like, are there any situations where a role-based approach or a network-based approach would work better? I would say from NextLabs' perspective, the most secure way to go is to combine the different approaches. So again, we don't, as mentioned in the presentation, we don't see data-centric security as replacing and network-centric security. We see the best approach as having both. Sometimes it's referred to as like the Swiss cheese model, where you have multiple layers of security to make sure that any attempts to bypass that security doesn't have to just get through one method. If it gets through one, then it'll be blocked by another. So we see it as complementary, but we really don't see any situations where it would be bad or negative to implement data-centric security. Victor, are there any situations that you see where data-centric security is not particularly applicable?
No, honestly, no. I think that even our clients are demanding this more and more, because a network-centric approach typically or traditionally only includes from a logical perspective, the rules and authorizations. But of course, that is not longer sufficient. And well, if we want to implement that kind of approaches, as we have explained previously, that typically needs that top-down approach that we have shown with the 13 layers, and that is a long-term journey. So for that reason, these kind of data-centric approaches are much more interesting in the sense that implements the side-by-side approach. We are able to protect the data directly without the need of putting all those layers on top of the data previously.
Yep. Thanks. Another question that I have here is, is around like, what are the suggestions for where to get the attributes for implementing attribute-based access control? And I would say that um, our approach would be to have it be pulled directly. This is one of the advantages of having an attribute-based approach versus a role-based approach, is that you don't have to go in and create new roles for each combination of attributes or each set of access or that you want to give different users or different groups of users. Definitely roles should be incorporated. We're not saying that you shouldn't use roles as some of the attributes. I think that roles and groups of users, especially through whether it's from LDAP or any other authentication system, are very valuable and should be incorporated. But our approach is that the more things that can be automated, the more things that can be pulled automatically from existing systems, there's fewer opportunities for edge cases or any other situations where something slips through the cracks and you haven't covered a particular security case, both for inadvertently giving access to somebody who doesn't have access, or even also accidentally locking out somebody who should be having access, therefore preventing their access to mission critical data or resources. So so the more that it can be automated, the fewer manual steps that are required, I think the better. So this is so another question that is related to this is whether we find it challenging managing security at the attribute level as systems evolve. In cases where new attributes get added, old might get deleted. How do you stay up to date with teams on this? I think that I would say I'll answer first, and then I'll let Victor offer his perspective as well. I think that when designing the policies, they do need, the best approach would be designing them in the same way that if you're designing software code, you want it to be robust to handle a variety of different situations. So you don't want it to fail if an attribute is missing. You want it to be to adapt, so that if that a particular attribute isn't available or isn't defined for a user, that you're still covered with the definition. From a security approach, it's more secure to fail open, and so that's by default. If the attribute isn't there, then you don't allow access. But it probably depends on the organization and specific data that's being protected, and what you're writing the policies for, as to whether it makes sense to default to denying access versus default to allowing access if a particular attribute is not defined. Victor, do you have any thoughts?
Yep. That is a good question. And well, basically, clients that are more interested in an attribute level approach are those that typically are using the pattern derived roles approach. And that means that the clients are, at the end of the day, managing a huge number of roles, because basically they are multiplying by all the different aspects that they are using for the derivation. So this approach, of course, requires some effort in order to keep the attributes updated. But I can tell you that this is the effort is significantly lower than compared to the traditional approach, when you are have an exponential number of roles because you are multiplying those roles by the criteria that you are using for that role derivation. So I agree with Tony on that. That of course we are saving a lot of time, and this approach is much more secure. Requires change the mindset in the sense that you are managing these attributes, but of course it's much more secure, and you are saving a lot of time in terms of management.
Thanks, Victor. I'm not seeing any other questions right now, so I just want to pause and give everyone time to ask any questions. I will, as a reminder, this webinar is being recorded, and after the webinar, everyone will get an email with a link to the recording once we have finished posting it online and making it available. If there's any follow-up questions that you have, you also can contact us and let us know. We're happy to follow up with any also one-on-one conversations as well to talk about the specifics of how what we covered today can be applied to your organization. Other than that, I think feel free, once we have sent out the video, to share that with anyone that you think might find it useful. So I'll just pause a little bit here. Victor, any final thoughts as we wait to see if there's any more questions from the audience?
Well, thank you so much. Thank you so much for attending the session, and I hope that this has been interesting for you. Thanks for your attendance.
Okay, with that, I think we'll call it a wrap. Again, if you have any other questions afterwards, send those to us. Otherwise, we'll be letting everyone know the link to the download. But thanks once again for joining us. I'd like to also thank the Victor for joining us and offering us IBM's perspective and point of view on this topic. Take care.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye. Take care.